this is Tommy, and welcome to A Musical Adventure. I hope that you're all safe and well and taking care of yourselves out there and staying healthy and practicing social distancing. It's a new phrase that we've learned. So today I want to talk about books. I'm going to talk about Beatle books and share some of my Beatle books, Beatle collection books for you guys. And if you're wondering kind of some stuff to get and stuff to avoid, hopefully this will help. And maybe you've got some suggestions of some things that you want to add to the list. I have a bad habit of when I'm out and about and in bookstores or shopping Friends of the Library sale or anything like that, picking up any and everything Beatles related. And I'm not going to show all of my Beatle books to you guys because I just don't think it's all necessary. But I'm going to highlight some and talk about them as we go through. And I'm going to start with this one because first off, it's on the top of my stack. This is John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Me, The Real Beatles Story. This is by Tony Barrow. Most of you know Tony Barrow as the Beatles publicist and PR consultant. He started working with Brian Epstein and the Beatles in 1962. And was all the way through Apple Corps and the birth of Apple Corps, and went on to work with several other bands. This book doesn't, and I'm reading it now. I've only just started it. It really doesn't purport to be a true biography. And as he says in his introduction, I'm not claiming to be any kind of biographer by any means, but I was there, a firsthand witness. So I'm not sure about the reliability. So far, it's well written, so it reads really nicely. Tony is a good writer, and so it's an interesting book. And he was pretty close to the guys, and so he has a lot of firsthand knowledge. Like I said, I've not seen anything in here so far that's raised any eyebrows for me yet, and I'm usually pretty cynical about these things. The other book I want to show you guys is one that's pretty popular with Beatle people, and this is one, as it says on the front, The Definitive Biography by Philip Norman. It's called Shout, The Beatles in Their Generation. This is a book that came out in the early 80s. It was one of the first probably comprehensive biographies on the Beatles. It came out just shortly after Lennon died, and I think the idea was that Philip Norman this was supposedly going to be like the first real in-depth Beatle book that came out on the heels of the Hunter Davies biography, the official biography, as it were. This book is interesting, and I will say this about Shout. This book has a little bit of controversy, and those of you who have read it can attest to this, that it was very, very much anti-Paul. When it came out, it kind of presented Paul McCartney in a very negative light. Now, this is sort of the beginning of this whole thing, and it's kind of, I guess, what kind of interested me in talking about these books was that, John kind of had this interesting sort of mythology that was built around him. He was unfairly taken from us through a very violent and untimely death, and John kind of became this almost I won't say a martyr, but he certainly built in status that he was sort of the innovative, really, really great Beatle. And Paul kind of had this unfair thing that he lived, and he was cute, and he was a people pleaser, and let's face it, Paul made some pretty fluffy music, throughout his career. But it kind of became that John was the edgy, witty one, and Paul was sort of the light, fluffy one. And I think this book kind of contributed to some of that mythology. And it's kind of, Paul's worked very hard to shake some of that and to take some rightful credit and kind of restore his place in Beatle history. And the years have been kind to Paul, I can say. But Philip Norman followed up later with a book, John Lennon, The Life. And this is a John Lennon biography. And I've got to say that it really is probably one of the better Lennon biographies that I've read. It's a very thick book, and there's a lot of information in here. But, the thing about biographies that's really kind of hard and difficult and Hopefully some of you guys will comment on this, but one of the things I find interesting about biographies and what makes them so difficult is that when you take the subjects, you're either going to build them up to be sort of these iconic, perfect people, or you've got an axe to grind and you're going to tear them down and turn them into these sort of evil monster people. And so Lennon was certainly one of those in this book, and those of you who have read it can say this was the first Lennon biography I ever read, the Albert Goldman book. And Goldman definitely makes some wild accusations. It was one of the big definitive Lennon biographies when it came out, and it certainly ruffled quite a few feathers, including those of Paul McCartney and anyone that read it, because Goldman really was really nasty to John and was very, very much trying to tear John down. And it doesn't try to work so much as a biography as it does a sort of what's the word, a trash piece maybe. So that's tough. Interestingly enough, the story on Philip Norman is that he also wrote the Paul McCartney, a companion to the Lennon book, Paul McCartney, The Life. I read this one very recently, and it's quite interesting because I think Philip goes about setting forth some of the wrongs that he'd done in Shout. Paul did sort of give a tacit or silent approval for Philip to write this book, because the Lennon book was decent enough. And so this is probably serves as one of the better McCartney biographies that's out there. And I think that Philip kind of made amends a little bit with Paul and any bad will that came about from that. But I would recommend both of the Norman biographies if you're interested in John and Paul separately. I think these two are probably two of the better biographies that I've read on them. Biographies can be a weird thing. Autobiographies, work. There's the Barry Miles Paul McCartney book that I think a lot of people point to, and that was I think he worked with Paul on that. So again, you have to be careful. You have to keep an open mind. Are they tearing people down? Are they not? What's the story? Here's a coffee table book. I'm a real sucker for Beatle coffee table books. This is Imagine John Lennon. This is kind of pretty official. Yoko did the foreword. And this is a sort of companion piece to the film that came out in 1988. A lot of pictures. Again, coffee table book. And it kind of works in conjunction with the movie, the 88 movie, which was kind of one of the first film biographies on John. A lot of great pictures and photos. Not so much a biography or anything, but some really, really great stuff in here. Some unseen pictures at the time that came out. So quite interesting and worth picking up if you see a copy. Another coffee table book. Oh, it's down here. Paul McCartney paintings. This is one that Paul. It's a collection of Paul's artwork that he did. And so here's a lovely photo of Paul at work in about 1990. Paul kind of took up painting throughout his career, I think in later on, and it's quite interesting when you're talking about because John is considered to be the artist because John went to art school, and so for Paul to sort of show any kind of paintings or do anything like that, it's kind of a brave thing to do. I think his work is interesting. It's colorful. I think he's definitely unique. I asked an art friend of mine, would these paintings be considered good if it weren't Paul McCartney? And art is so subjective. It's such a difficult thing. It's another book that I picked up recently, Postcards from the Boys by Ringo Starr. It's got a neat lenticular cover here. There you go. You can see it now. The change. There's John, Paul, George, and then Ringo. And these is a collection of postcards and things that were sent. Here's a postcard from John and Yoko that the other guys in the band had sent George over time. Ringo, you are the greatest in the world, really. It's right after the White Album. These are all sort of different postcards that were sent. Quite a few from John and Yoko, but it's neat. Let me see if I can find one from Paul in here. There's a lot from John and Yoko. John and Yoko definitely stayed in contact. And John was obviously fond of Ringo, and sent quite a few postcards to Ringo over the years. And so this kind of collects those things. And here's one from George. You can see that. And so it's a neat little book to kind of flip through and look at, and see kind of the love from the McCartneys. So the love, it's a very sort of presented with a lot of love. Just really quick, I want to talk about Bruce Spicer, any of the Bruce Spicer books, if you're looking for discography. And this is a book on the White Album, and this came out a couple of years ago when the White Album relaunched. But it's sort of an in-depth look at the release of the White Album, and really great pictures. But any of Spicer's biographies are really, really worth a look. Here's one that's an older book. I don't know how hard it is to get. John Lennon in My Life. This is a book by John's childhood friend, Pete Shotton. This came out in the early 80s. It's kind of it's a light read, a lot of pictures, and Pete was around in the early days. You can see Pete back there. He played with the Quarrymen, and so he had a lot of firsthand knowledge. And there's a lot of love in this book. There's some things in here that I sort of scratch my head at. He takes credit for some things. He was around, during a lot of that the Beatles period. He was around John in particular, particularly at Kenwood. He does claim to be Apple's first director. I know he was with the Apple organization. And John stayed close to Pete for quite a while, and was around. He was a firsthand eyewitness to a lot of events that went on. And so, again, it doesn't claim to be thorough or anything like that. But it does claim to be. It's like I said, it's a light read. What are your thoughts on this one? I mean, he certainly doesn't try to tear John down or anything like that. I enjoyed this book quite a bit. The Longest Cocktail Party. This was produced by Mojo Books. This is written by Richard DeLello, and he sort of kept a diary of his work. He worked at Apple. He called himself the house hippie. And so this deals a lot more with Apple Records and what was going on there. It's not really a Beatles book, but it's fascinating because it sort of talks about his time with Apple. Now this came out, I think, originally in the early 70s, and so he was there for a couple of years during the Apple years. And so there's a lot of detail about that time. Not really a biography, but an interesting read. But it was republished by Mojo Books, Mojo Magazine, and so quite an interesting read. Some of the other guys that were around the time, All You Need Is Ears, the George Martin autobiography, which is quite good. It's not like to me, it's not a. I would say kind of any kind of definitive thing, but George, charming guy, and was around for a lot of that stuff. And so it says the inside personal story of the genius who created the Beatles. But it's a fun book, and George Martin is not going to ruffle any feathers. Another one that I've not read yet, so I'm not going to talk about it. I do have it. It's on my to-read list, the Geoff Emerick book. I've read that there's some questionable things in this book. Some of the memories are a little different. But, Geoff was the engineer, worked with George Martin. And so this is sort of, another first-hand account, being around during the creation of some of the music that was there. And here's another one I've not read yet. I've picked up, but I'm looking forward to getting into it. Tune In This is the Mark Lewisohn book. This is volume 1, so this deals to the early years of the Beatles, and so this is kind of one that I think people have been kind of waiting on. It's very comprehensive, very big, but kind of goes through the early years of the Beatles. Mark Lewisohn. And speaking of Mark Lewisohn, Mark seems to be kind of the kind of knowledgeable guy on the discography of the Beatles, and so this is one, the Beatles Chronicle, the complete Beatles Chronicle. This guy really kind of, Lewisohn was around, and so these books are really good reference pieces of where the Beatles were, when and where. And so it goes into great length about what they were doing on particular days, like Sunday, March 1st, 1964, Studio 2, EMI Studios. So it's not so much biography so much as this is where they were, this is what they were doing, this is what they were working on, and what they accomplished. And so this Beatles Chronicle book goes into that. So it's a very comprehensive sort of book. And of course, what I would say is like one of the Bibles of Beatles is the complete Beatles recording sessions. This is the other Mark Lewisohn book. Paul McCartney did the introduction. And so this is the official story of the Abbey Road years, 62 to 70. Another good reference book. It kind of works in conjunction with the Chronicle. The Chronicle is a little more in depth, but this kind of goes through everything that was going on, at different points. It goes in chronological order. What was recorded, when and where. Very comprehensive. It's a dry read, but it's essential for anyone that wants to know what was going on, and wants to reference what was happening with the Beatles, when and where. And I thought I'd pulled it, and I don't see it, and I guess I have it in a different place. But the Beatles anthology, the book, which is kind of a companion piece to the film set and to what was going on there, which again, pretty comprehensive. It was for the Beatles, by the Beatles, and so it goes into a lot of great detail, and it's a fascinating book. It's a coffee table book. It's huge, so it's not one you're just going to sit down and read cover to cover. And finally, one of the last things I want to show you guys, and this is one that I did myself. I did this back in the 90s. But this is the Usenet Guide to Beatles Variations, version 2, Joseph Brennan. I printed this out and use it. It's a reference book, but it basically goes through each Beatles song, and it talks about the different variations, the mono, stereo, the American versions versus the American versions. Just what are the differences in them, how they were released. And so it's a little nerdy, it's a little dry, but if you ever want to reference and say, okay, what's the difference between the mono version of let's just randomly pick a song here. Let's go to Got to Get You Into My Life. The mono, it talks about when it was recorded, the basic recording. Was done on April 8th, 1966. Any additional recording, April 11th, May 18th, June 17th. The master tape. The releases, the mono, Parlophone Revolver, 1966, U.S. Capitol. The stereo versions and the CD version. And then it talks about the differences. The mono has a longer fade. It's 8 seconds. It's got louder bass and percussion. The brass sound on mono was augmented on June 20th, lifting the brass sound from the master and over. So it's very detailed, but if you ever want to know all the nuances of the different Beatle recordings, and I think you can still find this online, the Usenet Guide to Beatles Variations. And like I said, this is my own, I just put it in a binder, and I use it because I refer to it, and I don't just want to go to the internet. This is pre the days when I had a phone and could just pull this information up and look at it. It's nice to have. But those are some Beatle books that I've got and thought I'd share with you. I think the Norman biographies are the good for the individual guys. I think that anything with the Lewisohn name on it is pretty good and comprehensive. And like I said, I'm enjoying the Barrow book. There are some avoid books like don't bother, like the Lives of John Lennon. It's just they're just trashy. But what do you guys think? Do you have some Beatle books that you've read that you think are great, and some I may need to track down that I didn't show here? Some I may have and just didn't decide to show them, like stuff like in His Own Right and some of the other books. But I do have them, and I've got a lot of Beatle books, and so I don't have time to show them all. This video is already kind of running a little bit long, but Beatle books. Comment down below. What do you think? There's some that you prefer, some you hate, some that I've kind of given the thumbs up to that you're like, what is he thinking? Let me know. I'm always interested to read up on my favorite band. And some of you guys have probably read way more books than I have, and so I'd like to know about that. Hope you're all taking care of yourself. Hit the little bell down there. Get notified when any new content comes up. And I'd appreciate that. Subscribe, like, share the video if you feel so inclined. Give the old thumbs up on that. It's always nice, and it lets me know that you're watching and enjoying what I'm doing here. And take care of yourselves. I'll see you all soon. Keep spinning those records. Thanks and bye.